Hey there, today I'm bringing you my conversation with Brian Fraser. Brian is a pastor, he's a former seminary dean, and he's the founder of Jazzthink, which is an organization that uses the concepts of jazz and music to develop leadership skills in nonprofits. It's really cool. Brian and I get into the difference between being a disciple of Christ and an ambassador of Christ. So if you've ever sat around a table with somebody else or maybe just by yourself and wondered how can we make outreach and evangelism work in today's cultural context, this is a can't miss episode. Can't wait for you to hear it, so let's go. Hey there, welcome back. My name is Mike. I'm a church helper, and my goal is to help your church make every decision on purpose. Now, before we get going with our interview with Brian, a couple things that I just like to remind you of. You can catch this episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on YouTube. You can follow us on social. And what we'd really love for you to do is to join our email list. We send out one email a week with some practical ministry tips. I think, getting those would be really helpful. The people that receive them have always given us feedback and said they love the things that go on there. Oh, and also make sure you just take that 2 seconds and subscribe to our podcast or our YouTube channel and leave a comment so that we know what you're thinking and we can talk back. Okay, today I'm talking to Brian Fraser, and throughout his university years, Brian ministered in Presbyterian congregations in Ontario. In 1985, he was appointed the dean of St. Andrew's Hall, which is a Presbyterian college in BC, and a professor of history at the Vancouver School of Theology. Brian left that in 2002 to establish Jazzthink, where he uses the wit and wisdom and workings of jazz to provoke smarter conversations and generate flourishing communities. He continues to practice the arts of nonprofit leadership as part-time minister with Brentwood Presbyterian Church in Burnaby, and he serves on multiple nonprofit boards and helps them through leadership things as well. In this episode, Brian and I dig deep into what it means to be a disciple and an ambassador of Christ and how to consider those terms practically when developing ideas for evangelism in today's cultural context. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode, so let's go. Well, hi, Brian. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today. Really excited to have you here.
Great to be here, Mike. Thanks for having me.
That's awesome. So just for the benefit of our listeners, why don't you just take a minute and share a little bit of your background and maybe why you're so passionate about, supporting nonprofit leaders and board members and church elders and that sort of tier of folks.
Sure. Born and bred Canadian Presbyterian, Niagara Falls, Drummond Hill Presbyterian Church there. Went to U of T, lived at Knox College through most of my education there until I got married. Did a BA in history, came back and taught in my old high school, did an MA in the history of education, worked as the general secretary of the student Christian movement at U of T, did my theology at Knox, and then did my doctorate in Canadian history, looking at the social gospel among Canadian Presbyterians at York University with Ramsey Cook. Then 8 years in the parish in Toronto, Bleed Presbyterian Church just below Yonge and Eglinton. Came out to Vancouver in 85 to become dean of the Presbyterian College out here, St. Andrew's Hall. Taught church history at Vancouver School of Theology until 2002. Started my consulting business called Jazzthink. Then after a Jazzthink gig, helping a congregation that the presbytery had tried to close 3 times, helping them reimagine a flourishing future, they started to ask if I'd come and work with them part-time. And so the 4th time I said yes and haven't had a moment's regret since.
Oh, that's awesome.
Now, in all of that, certainly by the time I hit my master's program, what I was interested in was organizational flourishing and the leadership that enabled that to happen in that order, which I think is really important, especially in the context of so much organizational development and leadership literature now that is kind of focused on the heroic individual that goes in and either creates or helps to resurrect or gently kills off an organization. And so I think this flow will come into our conversation over and over again. I think the proper biblical flow of organizational development and leadership is God creating a good creation and enlisting, creating humanity to help God care for that creation, and creating a church. Goes back to Abraham and the covenant to be a blessing to the whole of creation, a community to be ambassadors of that, and we'll get into that. And then leadership are those who contribute to the missioning of that community in the care of creation. And it's that broad and that cosmic, to use that, what may be a trigger word for some people.
There's a ton there, which I know we're going to get to. And we'll get to, I think we'll get to Jazzthink a little bit later on too. I'm excited.
Yeah, it'll kind of seep in.
Yeah, which is awesome. I'm excited to hear that. But something that we were talking a little bit a bit ago, and you mentioned even just now, is when we were having a conversation, we were talking about the difference between being ambassadors for Christ and being disciples of Christ. And that was a really interesting conversation for me, just the way you defined those two things, and then also the importance of how we're actually supposed to act and sort of be the church out in our communities. And that sort of weaves into a lot of the things that you just mentioned. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So part of this has to do with what the people I call the Duke Divines. So these are people who teach at Duke University, at the Divinity School, Duke Divinity School.
Okay.
And there's a guy by the name of L. Greg Jones, who's been kind of seminal in that community. So he coined a phrase, I can't remember how long, coined a phrase, traditioned innovation, which as an historian, I really like.
Right.
Because Northrop Frye, Sally McFaig were the people that I really got this from initially. But creativity arises between the lines of the tradition. And so it's not a question of coming in and creating something new.
Right.
Frankly, you don't have creating in the biblical sense is way beyond our pay grade.
Right. Of course, yeah.
There's one creator, and we've been spending all sorts of time, generation after generation, trying to replace that creator, and I don't think it's worked out horribly well. However, so my tradition is Canadian Presbyterianism, born and bred.
Right.
We adopted as our most contemporary subordinate standard. So Presbyterians take theology and how you think about your relationship with God seriously.
Sure.
And so we put together a document called Living Faith. And you've hung around Presbyterians enough, and Lauren's been born and bred at Presbyterian.
Right.
So that's a little green book.
That's right, yeah.
But in the introduction to that green book, which hardly anybody ever reads, what they say is, look, the great affirmation of the core truth of the gospel is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 19 to 21. And in essence, it's God was forgiving and reconciling the world to himself in Jesus Christ and making us ambassadors of that message. And the word for ambassadors is presbyuos. Right. So we usually say presbyuos and its connected words have to do with elders. It has to do with rulers, kind of rulers of the community.
Sure.
And we forget that dimension in the word that has to do with being an ambassador of the message of God's forgiving and reconciling love.
Right.
So if you went and asked 30 Presbyterians what the core purpose of the Presbyterian Church in Canada is, you wouldn't get that answer.
Right.
Would be my guess. But it seems to me, and we may pick up on this, but it seems to me that if we're looking to get to the jazz analogy, if we're looking for a melody line, for what jazz musicians call a chord chart,
right,
of what it is we're playing and improvising around and for, that's it. We are ambassadors of God's forgiving and reconciling love in Jesus Christ, in every relationship that we have.
right. Yeah, of course.
And the church is there to nourish us to flourish in that missioning.
Right, right. And how then is, okay, so because we don't talk about being ambassadors a lot. We talk about being disciples a ton.
The big thing is disciple making.
Right,
Let's be disciple making. And we quote Matthew, go and make disciples of all the world, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
and you're not saying disciple making is bad. What you're saying is that, there's a big difference between those two words, being an ambassador and being a disciple, they're not the same thing.
I think ambassador takes it to another level and ups the significance and the importance of it. Right. So, and when you read the discipleship literature, which you've done and I've done, this is there in a sense, but I think there's something, especially for Presbyterians, about the idea of ambassador, presbyuos, that's significant, and so is a tradition out of which we can innovate. The language I use is faithfully, wisely, and effectively.
Right.
So a disciple is basically a learner, a follower.
Right.
Sure. And my question is, what are you doing with the learning and the following?
Right. You're learning.
So that's great. I mean, you've got to do that.
Yeah.
But you start talking about being ambassadors, being a core of ambassadors.
Right.
And the body of Christ is a core of ambassadors for the message.
Right.
Of Christ, and it's more than just Jesus.
Right.
Right. This is not about getting into alignment, simply getting into alignment with Jesus. It's about how do you take that alignment and represent it literally in every conversation you have every day of your life.
Right.
And so having that, it seems to me that thinking through, I've formed a sense of trust and loyalty to the triune creator. The community of the Trinity is more and more important to me in thinking about church. So we are incorporated into a community, not just an individual, but into a community. Mm-hmm. And that shapes everything we think of in terms of the faith. And so there's a set of responsibilities, and I'm still kind of talking with people and asking people what they would imagine those responsibilities to be. I think at the core, they are tending to and caring for and inspiring and instructing through the four things that in my consulting work with congregations. So I always ask congregations what they value most about what the church offers them.
Right.
And what the church is doing to offer that value.
Right.
And in that second question, some version of, usually in this language, some version of worship, learning, fellowship, and service.
Sure.
Come up. Now, that's without any teaching on my part. Just I start by asking them that question.
Yeah.
And when you break it down, those are the 5 marks of the early church. Worship is liturgia.
Right.
Learning is kerygma and didache. Fellowship is koinonia, and service is diakonia.
Right.
So somewhere in kind of the DNA of these people who find the church as a valuable source of nourishing them to flourish in their lives.
Sure.
They understand what they're ambassadors of and the means they have to exercise that ambassadorship.
Right.
And so Peter Drucker, one of the great organizational development thinkers of the 20th century, once said to a biographer, he said, well, I used to ask my corporate clients, what's the most successful organization in Western history? And he'd say they'd come up with all sorts of options. And I'd finally say after about 15 or 20 minutes, no, yeah, you haven't come in anywhere close. He said, the most successful organization in Western history is the Christian church.
Right. Yeah, of course.
And then he'd go in and say, look, and here are the elements of building that culture
right.
in a way that is resilient, robust, adaptable, innovative, because no other organization has gone into as many different contexts over as many different periods of time and flourished as the church has. Now, it's a treasure in earthen vessels, right? I mean, all sorts of misrepresentations of Jesus' message that we've been part of, all sorts of traumatizing that we've inflicted. But still, we keep coming back to worship Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday to confess the misrepresentations and get fed on better ways of thinking about and being the church in the world.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting to me. Maybe it's just, because of, my age or the people that I've been around, or maybe some of the stuff that I've been reading. It seems like the church is right now, in a lot of what I see, almost more criticized for not being, adaptable and in sort of all of those things that you just described. Where do you think that disconnect is, or like, is there a change that we're seeing right now that maybe we're not one of the most successful organizations in Western history, or is that just always this natural want for us to do more, be better ambassadors, and are we just in a time where we're frustrated that it's not working as well as maybe it used to?
Yeah. So two or three dimensions of that question, because
there's like three in there. Yeah.
Well, no, but it's a crucial question.
Yeah.
So I think part of the difficulty are the negative assumptions that a lot of people writing about new worshiping communities, fresh expressions, new witnessing communities, the language keeps changing.
Right.
The assumption is that the churches are filled with a bunch of old stick in the mud people.
Right.
Who don't want to change, right?
Sure.
I mean,
yes.
they never say it quite that bluntly.
Yes, I've heard that.
But it's there.
Yeah.
And I think that's wrong.
Right.
Right. I've been consulting with churches now for 35 years. And I frankly never found that in any congregation that I've worked with.
Right. Right.
But I think the reason I haven't found it is that I haven't gone looking for it.
Okay.
Right. And so, I mean, there's that, I can't remember, there's that kind of folk tale about the traveler comes along and they ask the farmer what he's going to find in the next village. And the farmer says, well, what are you looking for? and the first traveler has, well, I've got all of these concerns and anxieties about what I'm going to find. I've been on the road for 4 years. And they're going to reject me and all of that sort of stuff. And the farmer said, yep, that's what you'll find.
Right, right.
And the next guy comes along with all sorts of positives. And the farmer says, yep, that's what you're going to find.
Sure. Yeah.
And so a big part of it has to do with, are we really open to the fact that the Spirit has been working in that congregation, in that community since it was formed, to help them be ambassadors of the message of God's forgiving and reconciling love.
Right.
And if you go in looking for that, you will find it.
Right.
Are there all sorts of things that are getting in the way of it happening more faithfully, wisely, and effectively? Absolutely. Right. But for me, it's a question of asking people, what do you value about what the church offers you? And how does the church deliver that value? Okay. Now, what's getting in the way of that happening better?
Right, right.
They know, right? They're not, I mean, the wisdom of most people in most congregations is far greater than most church consultants give them credit for, and they don't ask. right? They come in with an answer to impose rather than an opportunity as the community, the whole community. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is this idea that somehow the church is not in the world. The church is this kind of frightened community behind these garrison walls to keep out all the nasty things that are happening in the world. Right. And what we've really got to do is go out into the world and connect with the world, because we're not connected with the world.
Right, right.
And I'm sitting there saying, there's a guy by the name of Bradley Morrison, you may have run across him, wrote a book called Already Missional.
Okay.
And Morrison's point is, where do you think people on Sunday morning go after you pronounce the benediction? Right? I mean, duh. There's a blinding flash of the obvious.
Right, yeah.
They go out into the world. Have you asked them who they're talking to, who they're working with, what kind of issues that those people that they're encountering, what you can do as a church to strengthen them in their missioning in the world?
Right.
You know, since Jesus pulled together the disciples, we've been doing that.
Right.
Right. That's the nature of the church. Yeah. Now, what are you going to do to strengthen that ambassadorial core? Because it's already there and it's already in the world.
Right.
And if you don't convene conversations, right, this is where I think church leadership, it's a question of how do you become curious about what the Spirit is doing among and in and through the people who are gathered in that congregation. It can be 5, it can be 50, it can be 500, it can be 5,000, right? The church, through them, they are members of the body of Christ who disperse into the world to be Christ's ambassadors, to be Christ's blessing in every conversation that they have.
There's two
but
things.
If we don't value that, and if we don't see it, then we're not going to work with it. And people, I mean, the other piece about all of this is that people won't engage if they are not being heard respectfully.
Right, right. I was working with a church a little bit ago. This is, you sort of jumped me here. A couple different ones. I'm combining, two things into one thing here. But we were working with one church who was trying to figure out sort of what the community needed. And so we were going through this process. And I just kind of said to them, okay, like your homework this week is to go out and talk to everybody call the mayor, call your ward counselors, talk to community leaders, walk into the bank, do whatever it is, and find, the spiritual and physical needs in that community and bring them back. I said, and if you don't do that next week, we're not going to have anything to talk about because I'm not coming with anything. Right. And then, and during that same conversation, we were talking about sort of what you're talking about. It was under the sort of umbrella, I think, of the word of evangelism, but ambassadorship, discipleship, sort of that was the theme. And one person in this church was saying, I'm not sure how to talk about my faith in a way that isn't offensive, which was like a weird thing to say. Not like it wasn't a weird thing to say, because I think we're living in a culture right now where I think a lot of Christians are running scared to not say the wrong thing. But also, it was interesting, coupled with this other conversation of like, what does your community need? And so, when we talk about being an ambassador in our community, about, going, you leave the church, where do you go, right? Practically, how are churches, either doing or not doing a good job of finding out the needs of their community?
Yeah.
And then, do you think, maybe this is, I don't trying to be a trap question here theologically, but do you think people should worried about being offensive? Or like a lot of people think, sharing my faith is offensive in today's culture, but I'm not sure that that's the case. I think people are maybe just afraid that, what are the skills of ambassadorship? How are you actually reaching out to your community? That sort of thing. Am I like, you know what I'm saying by this?
Yeah, no, this is no, and they're crucial questions. So let me bounce off them in 2 or 3 different directions, or maybe even more, as you think of it, right?
Which is fine
now. So I think that part of it is to conceptualize the process of connecting with your community as over the long term rather than the short term. So you don't have to have the conversation about faith when you ask the question about what's your perception of the community's needs. Just ask that question and listen for the answers. And then go make notes on what you've heard. That's it. Right? Because chances are that's not going to be the last conversation you have with that person. So we co-create the church one conversation after another. And what we tend to do in our society is think about one conversation at a time. And that loads a whole different set of expectations and pressures and anxieties on that conversation. So think about curious conversations. Just go ask questions. I'll come back to that in a minute. I don't think we, especially as the mainline churches, and I know you're working with a whole range, across whatever that spectrum is. I hate labels, but there we go. We haven't done a very good job in allowing people to practice their articulation of their faith. And the reason we haven't is that we've tended to think of ministry, especially ordained ministry or ordered ministry, however one wants to talk about it, in terms of monological messaging. I'm the expert. I'm going to tell you how to be church. And it usually happens for most people on a Sunday morning. And it usually happens through the sermon. Right? And we very seldom do dialogical sermons. Like, what do you think? I mean, one of the things we're just nibbling at the edges of it around at Brentwood. But before every sermon, we have a conversation about a word to ponder. And so I choose a word or phrase from the scripture passage and literally ask the congregation, what comes to mind when you hear this word? And that conversation will go on for about 5 minutes or so. And when I publish the sermon, put it up on the website, that congregational wisdom is at the beginning of the sermon. And I'm listening to this stuff and saying, oh man, I wish I'd preached on that. And every now and then I'll improvise and work it into the sermon. But what it does is model this sense that we do our theology in conversation with each other. It's not the work of experts. It's the work of the whole community in understanding the significance of our relationship with God and how that puts us into relationship with each other, into relationship with the self God wants us to be, and in relationship with the community. So I think that that sense of the conversations being long-term. We do a lot of work with the jazz community at Brentwood. And we see that, so one of the things, this goes to Jazzthink, one of the things when I was thinking about beginning to consult with nonprofits, organizational flourishing and the leadership that enables that to happen. I've been a jazz fan since I bought Oscar Peterson's Canadiana Suite in 1965 at Sam the Record Man's in Toronto for $3.99. It was on sale. And but when I started thinking about what's the hook for the consulting that I want to do, that very few other people have, it's kind of that, how do you distinguish yourself as a consultant? And so I started digging into jazz and organizations, and there wasn't much stuff around, but what was there was just fascinating and intriguing. And one of the connections that came through early was the most common form of jazz in human experience is ordinary conversation.
Mm.
So you and I have been playing jazz for
Right.
for this entire conversation.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, there's vocabulary and grammar that we both understand. And so that gives us enough structure to have a fruitful, I hope, conversation together. But we're improvising around that vocabulary and that structure. And if you ask me the same question in 30 seconds, I'd come up with different ways of answering the question.
Sure. Yeah.
So at every point in our lives as we're having conversations, we're playing jazz, we're improvising. We're not reading off a script.
I love that.
Right?
That's so cool.
And so if you were to pay attention to and manage the sound and substance of your voice in a conversation, the way jazz musicians manage the sound and substance of their instruments in a performance, what difference would it make to the quality of community that you're generating? One conversation after another.
After another, sure.
So begin with the curious conversation.
Yeah.
What do you think? And listen with respect.
Right.
Because listening with respect is what creates safe space.
Right.
And welcome.
Right.
I mean, if you are content, and I think people have a gut sense of this, which is why they're reluctant to do what most people think of as testifying and witnessing.
Right.
And being evangelists. If you contend or if you criticize, you take up all the space and you push people out of the conversation.
Sure.
Right? The only space they've got is to agree or disagree.
Right.
And chances are these days, given the public perception of Christianity, if they haven't had any experience, or if they have had a toxic experience of the church, they'll just turn off and walk away.
That's going to be.
They won't engage in the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the difficulty that certainly folks like you and I and our understanding of the church, part of the difficulty we face is the public perception of the church in an increasingly secularizing society is becoming more and more negative.
Right.
And is focused on those dimensions of the church, those manifestations of the church that I would say grossly misrepresent Jesus and his message.
And if I can jump in, that's making people inside the church skittish.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like that's the perception from outside, but people from inside are hearing that and they're again trying to formulate this different way to have the conversation or this new strategy or are starting to doubt the ways that they would have talked about their faith before, because now all of a sudden mostly what they're hearing is negative. So they're going, oh, like I must be doing something wrong. How can I switch this? I think that's affecting how we're reaching out to our communities too, right?
Well, and I think the other piece that goes back to the monological messaging piece is that the way in which we have been teaching the faith, right? The kerygma part of the didache part of it, is that we've fallen into this trap of saying clergy or church consultants,
right?
Dare I include us in all of this, are the experts, and what we really have to do is just listen to them and parrot what they say.
Oh gosh, I make the joke. I've said this to you, Brian, all the time. If I ever find myself in a room where I'm the smartest person in the room, I get out of that room.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not a
but
good
I
room.
think so listen, and when you look at the normal rhythm of the life of a congregation, where do people have the space to practice articulating their faith?
Mm-hmm.
And there aren't a lot of places.
No, yeah, right? Because like you said, it's monological messaging. It's from the front. It's again, I'm sure you too, in your time, I've been doing this a lot less time than you have, but even I've started to notice that, it's the pastor's job. It's right.
Oh yeah.
Even simple things. Somebody new comes into a congregation and they're having a conversation with somebody they just met that was sitting beside them. And that person goes, well, let me go meet the pastor. And I sit there going, well, they're already talking to you. Why do they need to go meet? like they're building this relationship with you right now. Like, don't cut that short, right? I love that term you used, right? The congregational wisdom, right? It's something that we don't focus on enough, maybe.
The other phrase that we use a lot around Brentwood is dialogical discernment. Right. So I think that's a kind of classic Presbyterian tradition. We come to understand through the inner witness of the Holy Spirit among us and within us,
right?
What it is the Spirit is teaching us about the forgiving and reconciling love of God in Christ. As in John's Gospel in the 14th chapter, you're going to get the Spirit to teach you stuff that I haven't even talked about.
Right.
And so there's a tradition within Canadian Presbyterianism that's in the preamble to our ordination vows about the Spirit leading us into reformulating the faith for our time and our place. And it doesn't mean that we don't take the scriptures and that core message of God's forgiving and reconciling love seriously, but it does mean that we're humble about us having gotten it straight and clear at any time in our past.
Right.
So how do you create that safe space of belonging and of learning and of contributing and of innovating in a congregation? Well, you don't do it by taking up all the space, monologically messaging.
Yeah.
And I haven't actually done this, but it's one of those crazy Fraser ideas that I think would probably work.
Right.
And in terms of helping people figure out how to articulate their faith.
Right.
So most of us in mainline churches are 55 plus. I mean, the mainline church essentially is a Zoomer church.
Right.
Now, and we spend not all of our time, we spend far too much of our time agonizing over who isn't there.
Right.
Our kids aren't there. Our grandkids aren't there. The young families aren't there. The Mike and the Laurels aren't there. What are we going to do? Oh, let's go hire a youth worker.
Right. Yeah.
And $100,000 and 2 years later, because we never pay youth workers decently, 2 youth have come and we can't afford to keep the poor person around.
Right.
Anyhow.
And in those 2 years, very few of the youth ever actually met anybody else in the congregation.
Exactly.
Yeah,
we'll create these little bubbles and keep them there.
Yes.
Pizza and movie on Friday night.
We're going to build a silo just so we say we've got it. And then, for sure.
Exactly. Whereas at Brentwood, what we've done is started a big band, all of whom are in their 20s.
Oh, cool.
And so that's been wonderful. That's another story.
Right.
But I think the crazy idea is invite your kids and grandkids to dinner one night and talk about to help you plan your funeral.
Oh. Okay. My interest is piqued.
Now that I have your attention.
Yes. I mean, you had it before, but now I'm
leaning
into
still,
monitor.
And here's the chord chart for the conversation.
Right.
I'd like to have these scripture passages read.
Right.
I'd like to have these hymns sung.
Right.
I'd like to have so-and-so playing. I'd like to have so-and-so conducting my funeral.
Right.
Now, in every one of those situations, you have an opportunity to say, why do I like these hymns?
Right.
Why do I want these hymns sung as people are celebrating my contribution to their lives?
Interesting.
Why do I want these scripture passages read? What's significant and important to me about these scripture passages?
Right.
What's important to me about my relationship with the woman I want to conduct my funeral? How has she supported me? How has she been pastor to me and preacher and teacher to me and worked with me in the broader church and worked with me in the broader community? That little kind of set of functions comes from research. I wrote the history of Knox College for its 150th anniversary, and I wanted to find out what the church expected of clergy and expected the college to help prepare people for, rather than just let the college define what what they thought clergy should be.
Right.
So we read 1,000 obituaries.
Oh my goodness.
Because in the back of the Acts and Proceedings of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the annual national meeting, all of the ministers who died get a third to a half page of an obituary. And they're all written by buddies. They were all men in the time that we looked at it. All written by buddies who wanted to make them look good for the culture of the church.
Right, yeah.
So you can't rely on them for any historical data or for an accurate assessment of their real presence in the world.
Right.
But if what you want to do is find what the culture values most,
of course, because that person is going to write about and highlight those things. It's brilliant. That's brilliant, of course.
So what we came up with over 100 years and across every region in Canada in this order was pastor, preacher, presbyter, and citizen.
Interesting.
Right? So it's connecting with the people, loving your people.
Right.
Preacher is preacher and teacher. So being an ambassador of the message of the gospel.
Yeah, right.
Doing that within the connectional church, not just this little congregation, but in the broader church,
right?
Denominationally, ecumenically, globally, and then being involved in the community.
Right.
And it's not 4 specializations, it's 4 dimensions of one calling.
Sure, yeah.
And so that's, and when I say that to congregations, they say, yeah, that's what we want.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about how those 4 functions would work best for those people at this point in their history as ambassadors, a core of ambassadors of God's forgiving and reconciling love, and how we can collaborate and contribute together to make that a flourishing presence in the world.
Right. That's so. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I went down that rabbit hole, and let you get me out of that rabbit hole.
No, I know we're going deeper. No, so that's interesting because So what were the 4 things again?
Pastor, preacher, they preacher, but that a teacher as well, right? Presbyter. So involved in Presbyterianism, that's involved in the who are connectional church. So. Congregation, Presbytery, Synod, General Assembly, World Communion of Reformed Churches. So we're seen to be a branch plant, we might say, of the global church, of the Church of Jesus Christ.
So, pastor, preacher, presbyter, and then citizen.
Right. So citizen is how are you contributing to the welfare, to use Jeremiah's word, to the welfare of the city, because in its welfare, you'll find your own.
And I think, people, and again, this is just it's that monological view. It's people thinking it's the pastor's job. It's the hesitancy of your ability to get out there and talk about your own faith. Everybody has the ability everybody is practically at least 3 of 4 of those things in some area of their life anyway.
Absolutely.
Like, it's not like people, almost everybody knows how to teach somebody else about something. Almost everybody is a part of the community. Almost everybody has a group of people that they're caring about.
Exactly.
None of these characteristics are just, intended for ministers or pastors or ordained folks. Everybody has these that exist. I think what you do is they just, your congregation members will compare themselves to somebody who was trained to do this job 24/7, because it's not 40 hours a week. And then you'll, right. And then you'll
notice that, did you?
Right. Yeah. And then you compare yourself to that, but really it's everybody, again, going back to that, one conversation after another, as opposed to just one conversation, and the congregational wisdom. Everybody in the congregation has the ability to do that. And there's no winning at that. Right.
And so I think the task of leadership. So first of all, I think Presbyterian theology at its best understands leadership as collegial and corporate. Right. Nobody on their own has any authority in the Presbyterian system of governance.
Right.
You are part of a council. We call them courts. It's not, great language for our day and age, but it comes from the medieval court that was the community that gathered around the monarch to provide counsel about the well-being of the realm. So that's what church courts, councils, are all about. God reconciles us, brings us back into counsel with each other and God for the welfare of God's creation. That's what, anytime you are sitting on a governing board in any congregation, that's what you're doing. And so the question becomes, how do you contribute constructively to ordering, to provoking, calling forth the gifts that God has given that congregation and helping organize those gifts for the missioning of the church? That's your essential task.
Yeah.
On any governing board, we call them sessions and congregations. But it's so that the core principle of Presbyterian polity, that we define in Canada, is to take away all occasion for tyranny by ensuring full participation, to enable full responsibility. So that goes back to that being curious, listening with respect.
Yeah.
What I used to say with my students in Presbyterian polity is, listen, everybody should have their say, and they should also realize that everybody will not have their way. Right. So that's the collective wisdom. But it is that respect for an ordered way of being in dialogue with each other to discern the will of God for the missioning of the church in the care of creation.
How would you, just so you know, we talked a little bit before.
Yeah.
I had a list of about 8 other things that we're not going to get to today. But so, I'll get you out of here on this a little bit. Folks that are struggling with how to be ambassadors, right? Leaders, pastors, teachers that are trying to teach their congregations how to be better ambassadors. People that are listening to this that are elders or congregation members that are saying, I love this idea of being an ambassador for Christ in my community, but I'm still struggling. I feel like there are internal roadblocks there. We've talked a lot about, having curious dialogue. So maybe that's one way. What are some stepping stones, some ways that you would say, if you were coaching somebody through, here's how to be a better ambassador, or here's how to take an approach like that? What are some of the things that you would suggest people, think about, try, practice, that kind of thing?
This is a really simple thing, and it kind of goes back to the invite your kids and grandkids to come in and plan your funeral with you.
Right. Yeah, that was a great example.
Ask yourself, what's your favorite parable? What's your favorite text in the Bible?
Right.
One text, one parable. So, for example, around Brentwood, the 2 seminal parables for us are the parable of the sower, the parable of the prodigal son, and the parable of the sower.
Right.
And so it's hospitality, and how do you sow hope and healing in the world? Right. And that's how we kind of. So, a young jazz musician got involved with us, came up, wanted to be baptized and joined the church. Conversations about that. I said, what kept you here? Not what brought you here. I mean, I knew that it was the jazz. Right. But I said, what kept you here? This was a guy that'd been through some pretty serious mental health challenges and a bunch of other traumatizing experiences. And he said, well, first, it was the hospitality. You just accepted me as I was. But it wasn't in that. Anne Lamott says, the gospel is about accepting people as they are and not leaving them there. And so you engage in the conversations in Brentwood,
right? And
you're not going to be left there.
Right.
But you're always going to be, no matter where you are, and this guy's up and down, and he's, but Brentwood is always a welcoming space.
Right.
Looking for ways in which he can contribute to our ambassadorship for the gospel.
Right.
And so what's your favorite parable, your favorite hymn? What's the phrase? What's the one word or the one phrase that's most significant? And how would I talk about that with my closest friends?
Right. Just simplify it.
Simplify it.
Yeah.
Right. And so ask yourself that, what's the favorite parable? What's the favorite hymn? What's the favorite text? What's the most powerful word or phrase in there?
Mm-hmm.
And how can I imagine talking about it with people in my family, people in my work circles, people in my friends' circles, people I play golf with?
Sure.
And the conversation might open with, what do you think about? And then the word or phrase.
Right.
Right. And you may preface with it, I've been kind of mulling this over. I've been pondering this. I'm wondering what you think about. And trust the Spirit to take that conversation and do what the Spirit wants to do with it. You don't have to control it.
Right.
You don't have to control the result of that conversation. It's frankly way beyond your pay grade.
That needs to be on a billboard somewhere. You don't need to control the result of this conversation. That's absolutely. Because I think everybody who enters into, they're like, I'm going to evangelize today.
Yeah. And I got to get the result.
We're going to start here and we're going to end here. And that's right. And you just, the amount of stories that you read about that somebody says, this person said this to me in grade 10. And then this person said something to me when I was 22. And when I was 31, it clicked. Like you don't know. And we live in a culture where it's everything has to happen right now. What have you done for me lately? What has this conversation done for me lately?
Yeah. And you have to know exactly what the result is.
You have, or else it's an abject failure.
Yeah, exactly.
but
exactly.
that should be on a billboard everywhere.
But that timeline that you just laid out, when I was 17, when I was 25, when I was 31, and finally it clicked.
Right.
I mean, I've got all sorts of things in my life that didn't click until I was 55.
Right.
Talk about a slow learner. and the biggest thing that clicked at that point was you're forgiven.
Yeah.
And that was exactly what I needed to hear at that point in my life.
Right. Yeah. That's great. I love that. That's as good a spot to end as any, right?
Listen, when you've got a slot in the next couple of years and you want to go to the other questions, let's do it.
There's going to be a part I had this whole, I wanted to talk about church polity and how to maximize the use of that. And we need to talk about Jazzthink. I'd love for you to just spend a couple minutes talking about here at the end, like what you're up to and how you're using Jazzthink in your context, because I think that's really important. And how people can reach out to you to talk about all of these things to you more. I think that would be.
Well, you'll put the email.
I'll put all the links everywhere. But
I'm more than happy to respond. That's the best way to do it, is by email. Do you want to do kind of a 60-second elevator speech on Jazzthink? Please
give me the however many minute version of what you're up to with Jazzthink.
So we talked before about what got me into it. This idea that the most common form of jazz in human experience is ordinary conversation. So what can you learn from jazz musicians about performing through your conversations?
Right.
And your conversations are never, they are, but most conversations that you're aware of are not with yourself. They're with somebody else.
Right.
So 10 years into it, maybe 6-7 years into it, I came up with 5 types of conversations that, if you pay attention to having them, will enable you to make a positive contribution to the flourishing of your communities.
Okay.
And I developed an acronym for SMART and then added ER to the end of it. So you got that sense of continual improvement.
Right.
So the soulful conversation is this conversation you have with yourself, where you allow, in Christian terms, allow the Spirit to overcome that sense of shame that makes you negative about yourself. So it's minimizing the impact of your negative self-talk.
Right.
Mindful, the way I use it, is how do you connect in an allying way? Like, how do you make alliances with other people?
Right.
And you do that by beginning with curiosity. What do you think?
Sure.
What have you got to contribute to this relationship and what we're doing?
Right.
The astute conversation is how do you analyze and decide? Right? It's kind of the hard nose. What's going well? What's getting in the way of it going better? What are we going to do about it? The responsible conversation then is how do we assign accountability according to gifts, strengths, capabilities? And this is what often doesn't happen. How do we design support for people living into those accountabilities? So it's accountability and support that makes you enabled to be responsible. And then the trusting conversation at the end, I think trust arises when you pay careful attention to monitoring and measuring the faithfulness, wisdom, and effectiveness of what you're doing. And you're continually recalibrating and reforming that to be even more effective, wise, and faithful ambassadors of God's forgiving and reconciling love in every space God sends you.
So that's your acronym. So how do you do, you do workshops on this, right? You do teaching and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I've got a little booklet that outlines all of those and that actually suggests questions that you can ask.
That's great.
To open up conversations about all of those 5 dimensions.
And you have a website where people can find this information?
Jazzthink.com.
Okay, we'll make sure we link that and your email and
yeah,
all of your other contact information so that people can start picking your brain on all of the things. This was drinking from a fire hose today.
Well,
I tell you, we've had conversations.
I appreciate the opportunity
around this stuff in the past, and exactly what you just said is so true. You know, practically even in this moment, if jazz is about improvisation, and we're talking about improvising conversation, having the same conversation, but it's different every time. That's kind of we just did that. This isn't the first or second time we've had this conversation. It's just the first time we've recorded it, but this is certainly, different than the things we've talked about before. So
it is,
really thankful.
I hope we find opportunities to continue the conversation on and offline.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I'm so thankful that you were willing to take a few minutes today, or a lot of minutes. I really appreciate it.